Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you all to our panel with the filmmakers of Disney Pixar's Onward. I want to introduce our panelists today. I'm going to go in the order of the names here. We have Dan Scanlon, the film's director. Hi, Dan.
Hey.
We have Kori Rae, the film's producer and also animator on the film as well. Am I right about that?
No, that's Allison.
That'd be out. Okay. All right. Gotcha. We have Noah Klocek. Correct.
Either way works. Great.
Either way works?
Either way works.
Wow. Okay. He's the film's production designer, and Allison Ruthland, the directing animator of the film. Hi, Allison. I want to welcome you all to our panel. Let's get this show started. I'm going to start with Dan. Dan, from what I understand, the film has a very personal connection to something that happened in your life. Can you take us on the journey of where the concept of the film came from?
My brother and I lost our father when we were both really young. I was a year old, and my brother was 3. So we had no memory of him at all, and we were always asking ourselves how we were like him, who he was. And obviously our mom told us so many great things about him, but the mystery of who he was became stronger for us as we grew older. So Kori and I really tapped that story and that question to create this idea of these 2 elf brothers getting to meet their father for a day.
And I know since the film takes place in a fantasy world or a magical world, but the characters live in a world that isn't seeing its full potential. And you've got characters working in a Chuck E. Cheese and living very, I guess, average lives in the human world. But why did you pick that kind of a universe to tell the story in?
I think that, well, you mentioned it right away, which is interesting. The idea of a world that maybe wasn't living up to its potential matched the idea of young Ian, who was not living up to his, or was afraid, or was very self-conscious and not very confident. And we get to watch him grow and him find his magic. And we get to see him and his older brother Barley slowly affect people in that world to open up and find their own magic a little bit. But that was a part of the reason behind it. And then, quite honestly, the other reason was just we needed a way to bring the father back to life. And magic felt like the most romanticized way. And that led to this idea of, well, maybe this can be a fantasy, magic fantasy story that doesn't take place a long time ago, that is in our modern world. And that led to just the humor of mixing those 2 things up.
So Kori, when you were working with Dan on the film, what was some of your feedback at working with this world? Like, what were some of the things you wanted to see explored and to push the story forward?
Yeah, I mean, always, story first, character first. And so we really encouraged Dan to kind of dig into his own personal story and his personal life. And it was a little tricky at first. I think it was the first time that he was kind of telling something so autobiographical. And I think there was a hesitation almost for him to kind of make sure that it was a film for everyone and not, just his story. But we quickly found out that the even within Pixar, his story really resonated with a lot of us who had similar kind of experiences, if not necessarily exactly the same, but kind of had people in our lives who went above and beyond for us. And so we really were focusing on the story. And then in terms of the world, it was just, really figuring out, we wanted to have fun with it. And, we wanted to kind of take fantasy and put it in a modern world, but make sure that we had enough of the fantasy kind of character tropes and other material that it would be recognizable to people who loved fantasy. So it was just always a constant, like, finding that balance between the modern world and kind of fantasy. And so I'm sure Noah will talk about it later, but from a production design standpoint, it wasn't trivial. It's easy to talk about, but it was kind of difficult to pull off. So.
Yeah, I noticed in some of the designs, there were elements that we would see in our world, but very fantasized, with points and castle elements on buildings. So Noah, when you were given this task to create this world, to design this world, what were some of the things that you looked for in the art
Mm.
that you wanted to
Well,
put on the screen?
for me, the story, it always starts with the story and the characters. It's really hard, it's not only hard, but I think it's a disservice to design a world that isn't pulling from those, that isn't derived from the story. And so, as you said early on, that it was a world that we recognized, that was things we've seen, that there's parts of it that we called mundane in the beginning, and quickly started to call them familiar, because mundane sounded negative. And we really wanted a world that you could walk into. Anyone who's lived in this world could walk into this world, and yet then they would feel that it was a heightened version of this world. And so out of the gate, that was our touchstone, was who's the character and where they're going from. And what Dan said initially is, how do we identify with this character in our world that we live in? How do we recognize ourselves in them? And that was kind of the starting point for the whole design.
Interesting. And that also probably affected the color palette as well, looking for things that were very familiar to us.
Yeah.
With production design.
Yeah, and Sharon, I have to give Sharon Callahan some props on that one. She did a beautiful color script and lighting of the movie. But yeah, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that must be very hard to. And I'll say some of the scenes reminded me of Los Angeles, some Burbank, and things that were very familiar to me. But you'd mix it with mushrooms and castle elements and other things that were kind of in a fantasy world, but not at the same time. So
Yeah.
I would guess that it would be a challenge to find those right colors to blend it all together and have it make sense.
Yeah. A lot of it's about restraint. It's about making choices. And from my perspective as a production designer, while it's a really difficult job, it's less challenging than Dan and Kori and the story crew have to come up with, because they're coming up with this story from their heart, from nothing. And I have a guide, which is the story. And so as you go through the story, like one of the elements we knew that we did not want to use, we wanted to save blue for the spells. And so that immediately then helps me make decisions about the rest of the world. So we're going to limit the amount of blue that is used in the rest of the world so that you feel it's special when it's used for a spell. And all of those little hints as you go along the process come from the storytelling. When we learn something about Ian, okay, we're going to save that color for Ian. When we learn something about Barley, oh, Barley is this character, so we're going to save that for them. So a lot of it, I'm more of an archaeologist than creating something from nothing, because my job is to ask Dan 1,000 questions every day, like, what did you mean by this? And would Ian actually have this poster in his room or not? That's really what our job is that, and we're the storytellers as well, but we're rounding out this visual story that is kind of living alongside of the story that Dan and Kori and the story team is crafting.
Yeah, and to fit characters that fit into this world, and I'm going to jump in with Allison on this. I noticed a lot of there were centaurs and unicorns, apparently with mange, looking for food on the street. Things you would see in Hollywood. And what kind of challenges did you have animating those kinds of characters?
Yeah, we lovingly called those trash pegacorns. But yeah, it was challenging because every character was so different, and there was, each character had a different body type, and some of them were mythical, so they weren't obviously based on reality, but it was combining, reference that we had from animals and ourselves, our own acting, as well as like trying to imagine like what that body type would do in that situation. Like the Manticore, she's this great beast, but she's in this really tight costume and she can't move very well. She's wearing high heels at the beginning of the film. So we had to try and think about this huge beast wearing high heels and how she would move in that way, and just trying to find really interesting specifics about each character. For Colt the Centaur, he was kind of a combination of a swaggery cop and a horse. So just really putting those two things together was really fun.
One thing, just off of what Allison was saying, one thing that's so fun about watching these movies develop in art and in animation, and also what Noah was saying too, is for the first year or two, you spend your time describing character, describing places. And it takes forever to say, Ian is like a shy, nervous kid and blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly the first time you see it animated, you don't have to describe anything because he's moving shy and awkward. And it's so, and the same is true with the world. When you look at it, suddenly it feels the way you've been describing. And I can say, as someone who has to pitch these movies early on, there's a tremendous weight lifted off your shoulder of like, oh, I don't have to describe all these things and describe all these people. Suddenly the whole team is doing it through art and through motion.
That's so great. Were some of the character movements based on real people? You know, I know a lot of animators will sometimes look at Charlie Chaplin or, oh, Dan's reacting.
Oh, no.
Maybe I hit a nerve there.
No, I don't know, Allison, were they? I know.
Yeah, I mean, well, Dan's a great actor. He would always act stuff out as he shot briefed it. So we would partially base it on his acting as well as our own acting. We would shoot reference of ourselves. Some animators use reference of other characters in films or animals, or you kind of, it's like a collaboration of reference that all kind of comes together.
The voice actors.
And the voice actors, of course, yeah, looking at them, you know, Julia Louis-Dreyfus had this really specific mouth that we looked at a lot in terms of her mouth shapes, and as well as Chris Pratt had, you know, a definite Barley feel to him we could reference.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, Ian's character was afraid of everything. When I watched the character, obviously he's got a lot to overcome, and I think the story, it's really his story, right? His journey to find his father, to meet his father. Why was the choice made for him to be so afraid of everything?
I think he's loosely based on me and my brother and I's relationship. And I mean, like a lot of teenagers, I and Ian were insecure and lacked confidence. But I also think a big part of it was a sense that he needed, that maybe this other person in his life would help him figure out why he was this way. And they mentioned early on that Dad was bold, and that's Ian really thinking, wow, that is the opposite of how I feel at my age, and how did he become bold? You know, I think it goes back to that question of who was my father and how was I like him. There's also this sense that your parents are this blueprint to follow of who you're going to be or who you're not going to be, to be perfectly honest. And when one of them is missing, you don't have that map. And so you're not quite sure that part of yourself, that part of your personality and where it's going.
Did your brother see the movie?
Yeah, I didn't tell him about the movie at all
Yeah,
for the 6 years, I think, 5 to 6 years that it takes to make one of these. He knew there was a movie. He knew it was loosely based on experiences we had, but I waited to the night, the wrap party. The Pixar does a big wrap party with the whole crew when the movie's done. And we showed it to him there and he was blown away. Like Barley, my brother is incredibly supportive and encouraging, almost to the point of being like a parental figure. And so I knew he would say he liked it no matter what, even if it was terrible. But I think he's seen it like 15 times now, and he's bought every single shirt or piece of clothing or toy you can buy. His license plate on his car is Guinevere, just like in the movie now. I mean, it's amazing. And our conversations have become very, we always got along well, but now he's so open and loving, and we're always telling each other we love each other. I think I broke him.
Wow.
Yeah.
And hopefully his glove compartment isn't filled with parking tickets.
No, not at all.
That's great. So Kori, on the journey of making the film, was there a point where you thought maybe some of the story elements might be maybe a little controversial, or maybe create, maybe didn't fit in what you were trying to accomplish with it? I know there's a conversation where the brother says that there's a fourth memory of their father, and he talks about it. I think they're on the Big Cheeto, which
Right.
I think pulled a lot of, and maybe that might have been a point where you thought maybe that's too emotional, or maybe that's too deep, or maybe it's not deep enough.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm super happy with where it landed, and I think it was just the right amount for that particular character to kind of reveal. And we knew that Barley had to reveal something so that Ian could kind of get a glimpse of what Barley actually needed in the film. And so, Dan, I can't remember how many. I'm sure we had multiple versions of that, but I don't remember when or how we landed on that fourth memory. But I think it certainly was. We didn't want to give too much. We didn't want it to be super graphic. We just wanted to kind of hint at that Barley had a regret that he never really got to say goodbye to his father, and how do we kind of make it in his character. And so I think we struck the right balance and found the perfect both location, because saying it on a giant Cheeto is just ridiculous, and great. But yeah, Dan, did we
wanted, when we always had this ending, that that Ian would give up his opportunity to meet Dad and give it to Barley. That was always our ending from the very beginning. We were always working toward that. And in versions that we showed early on, people felt like, well, why does Barley deserve it more than Ian? Why does anyone deserve it more than the other? I didn't feel there was a matter of deserving it. I felt it was that Ian felt like that he had all the things he needed from his brother that he thought he needed from his father. But it did make it stronger to say, but it would be even better if we felt like we knew what Barley was getting out of it. Right. So that's where the idea of, oh, he never said goodbye. And then it became a balance of one brother wanting to say hello and one brother wanting to say goodbye, and asking the question of, or letting Ian determine which one he felt, was more important, and taking that role to make that sacrifice.
Right.
So were there parts of the story that were left out intentionally when you were getting to the end of the story, like, we want this to happen and that to happen? Were there things that you decided, let's not put this in, it's not going to help us out?
Oh yeah, we've got several movies of that. We've got hours and hours of stuff we cut out of the movie, which is pretty normal at Pixar. Like I said, it takes 5 to 6 years to make a movie, and we try everything. It's I think one of the best things about working in animation, where it takes so long, is testing things, trying things out. But it can be difficult to cut things, and I'm sure Noah's art department had to build things that got thrown out, and Allison's department had to animate things that got thrown out. We try to be respectful when that happens, but everyone seems to understand at Pixar from years of doing this, that it's, as both Noah and Allison were saying, it's all about character, it's all about story. No one would want to put the most beautifully designed character or the most beautifully animated character into a moment and not have them need to be there to tell the story.
Right.
I also think that Dan, from the beginning, while we tried lots of different versions of the story, you always knew the core. You knew where you started and you knew where you wanted to end up. And so which is not always the case at Pixar. We have to point that out. There's sometimes we have no idea where we're going until the last minute. But this movie always had this really strong, I forget the phrase you used to use, but it was like, we lead them in with fantasy and then we sucker punch them with emotion at the end, or I can't remember what that was, Dan, but something like that. And that was always the intent of the movie. And so it was just about, how does that structure come together that feels satisfying? And you told me when I got on the first day, I think, I know what the ending is, we just have to earn it. And that was what the trail was in this whole movie, was how do we earn this ending of a sacrifice for someone you love? And I think that was the whole challenge. Yeah.
Interesting. We do have one question. I mean, it's kind of an interesting one. Brothers to score the film because they were siblings, or was that just incidental?
Kori, do you want to?
It was our good fortune. I think, did it influence us a little? Maybe unconsciously, but I think, we were really looking for a composer or composers who could really touch on the emotion of the film, where and kind of deliver on both the fantasy aspect and also the highly emotional aspect. So, but it was crazy when we did meet them. We hadn't met them before, and then once I mean, not only are they brothers, but Dan, you might want to speak to. I mean, I think from a nearby area that Dan was from, they had a lot of similarities.
They jokingly said like, "Oh, we're working out our own stuff during this." Like, we're able to hash out some things. But again,
Yeah.
the Danas bring. I mean, they can do anything. It's amazing the versatility they have, which was important too. But they do big, sweeping, epic themes, which we needed for fantasy, as Kori mentioned, and then of course deep emotion.
Yeah.
One of the scenes I really loved was when they were in the I'm going to call it in the maze, and there's this wall of green jello, is what I call it. And it was, where did that idea come from?
Well, I think the gelatinous cube is a part of role-playing history. It's been around for a long time, and we just wanted a deeper cut. But Noah, do you want to talk about how you designed the cube? the research?
Yeah, I think for us that was like the purest hit of fantasy design of the whole movie. So it was kind of crescendoing to that moment, and we call it the gauntlet, that area that you go through. But if you look at, early on in the movie, there's like a 70-30 split on fantasy and familiar. So 70% of the world is familiar. It's like you said, like Burbank or whatever. And then 30% of it's that fantasy element. But as soon as they leave the city, we start to strip the familiar away. And so when you're outside in the mountains and, with Guinevere and they're riding through the hills in the van and that kind of stuff, they were stripping away slowly. You'll lose telephone poles, and then there's no houses, and then it's just almost a fantasy environment. But then you go underground and everything that's from the modern world is cut away, and you're back in the pure fantasy of the movie. So that was kind of the idea, was that the crescendo and just pack pure fantasy into that moment.
Didn't you also have to like take gelatinous molds and like try it with some milk in it to make it less see-through? And then we decided we like it. I mean, some days like that when we're holding up, cheese puffs to the windows and seeing what they look like with light streaming through them, I see all the reference of you all doing that is pretty crazy to think that that's what you're being paid for that day. It's part of what's so fun of working in animation.
Yeah, we did a lot of Jello drops too to figure out how much that Jello should shake for that size, and so it's good fun.
Crucial research.
Yeah, crucial research.
You got to do what you got to do. And one of the things I really loved about the film was you have the father there having a relationship with the boys as they're trying to bring him back to life. Allison, you basically your team had to animate a pair of pants and emotion. And there's a scene where Ian and his father are connecting with their shoes, with their feet, which takes place of hands. Can you speak a little bit about that, about bringing the character to life?
Yeah. Usually, we have a character with a face that we can help emote, but this was particularly challenging. And we drew reference from lots of different places for the performance of Dad, but for that really tender moment, it was really just subtle movements and really just trying to communicate as much as you could with just foot touching and tapping, like how much it taps, like the speed of it, like, or just like really, really subtle things. But all those things kind of came together to create that performance. Even like how Dad approached Ian, he was a little bit kind of cautious in his walk, like all these little subtle cues to give you the acting performance just with the legs and the feet.
Did you have somebody put the pants on and do some role playing for you guys so you can kind of get a sense of what the bottom half does?
Yeah, early on,
or...
Dan, you guys did a lot of green screen tests where they filmed, like they had a green screen top and filmed their body, your pants, doing stuff, and then cut out the top. And it was really interesting. I don't know if you want to speak to that more.
Well, did you find that, because I feel like what we got out of that was, we're all dancing around and putting our feet in the air as high as we can, and
Right.
like very clown-like. It feels like what came out of that was a little goes a long way, and no one moves like that in real life. So I feel like all I did was hurt my back that day. That's all that came of it.
That's right. You were trying to high five with your feet or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but then I see what you take away from that, and you're all doing these very subtle, like if someone doesn't have a face, you're just looking for any way to see them communicate. So a little tiny move of the shoe is, you read into it a lot.
There was physical stuff that came out of that day, though, because I remember trying to stand up without your hands. We just take that for granted. And sit down without your hands. Like, how do you sit down gracefully without putting your hand down first?
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of that kind of stuff that came out of those tests.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you-
The physicality stuff was fun to look for. Yeah.
So you guys green screen pants and you work with Jello. That sounds like a fantastic job. I want to do that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier about the role playing element of that in there. How much role playing made its way into the story? That people are into Dungeons and Dragons and other games where they create characters and inner worlds that they create themselves. Did that play a part in some of the story elements?
Well, I think again, wanting to make it a modern fantasy, we wanted to take advantage of things you couldn't do in another fantasy world. So for the longest time, we had the boys walking everywhere, and then we thought, oh, they could have a van, like they could have a car in this movie, and they couldn't in other movies. So we made sure that they did, and the same was true with how they would get information about the old days, how they would get fantasy information about how spells work, led to the idea of, oh, what if there was a game? What if a lot of role-playing games, I think, in the early days were based on actual historical wars. So it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that this would be their history and that they would make games of it. And I think we're always looking for just fun ways to just find something unique to that world that you couldn't do anywhere else.
Right.
Oh, wonderful. And I know with the production design, I know trying to match the elements. And Noah, was that also a challenge to bring this and have it mesh into the world you had already created on screen?
Oh, you mean the
But you have the scenes that look like Los Angeles and then the familiar, and then you jump into this, suddenly it goes into this new realm, which is very cool. But did you find any challenges making it mesh, create a cohesive visual storytelling?
Yeah, I think ironically, I'm a fantasy nerd from way back, so a lot of the movie was Dan and Kori holding me back from going full fantasy. I mean, like, that's great, Noah, but it's
Really?
not going to work for this moment. Yeah, I mean, well, who doesn't love creating a fantasy world? So, like, that was half the selling point for the movie for me. Like, Dan and Kori, the first thing I heard is like, you had me at fantasy. Like, I'm just going to show up for the movie. And so the challenge was really finding this beautiful balance that tells the story. Like, designing fantasy is not the challenge. It's finding, and it's never the challenge. There's a great quote from Roger Deakins about light, and he said something like, making something beautiful is much easier than making it suit the story. And I feel that's the job of the production designer. It's really easy to make beautiful stuff. It's really hard to make stuff that really supports what's going on in the story and heightens it and makes you, and gets out of the way, frankly, of the story and allows it to happen, but heightens it at that moment. That's the challenge. And so for me, that's all between the balance of fantasy and familiar. It wasn't about one or the other.
Interesting. Let's dive into the voice actors. Got a great cast, by the way. I felt that Chris Pratt and Spider-Man.
Holland.
Thank you.
Peter Parker.
The voice cast was great. How did you guys go ahead and decide on these folks? What were you looking for when you were looking for voice acting?
Well, Kori, I mean, it took a long time.
It did. And, Ian, I think the challenge, especially in animation, is you need the character to be written and developed, and far enough along to understand who they are. And it was interesting. We really struggled with Ian at first and really trying to dial into, exactly who he was and what were his qualities and what were his traits. And we knew what he wanted and that kind of thing, but we needed everything else to kind of fill in. So we started looking, and then and we definitely wanted to cast him first, because whoever we cast for Ian would kind of help determine the remainder of the casting, especially Barley. So so we just, after listening to hundreds of actors, and we do it blindly, like we don't know who we're listening to necessarily, and they play clips and we hold up images of the character that we've designed, and kind of just listen. And the initial thing that Tom brought was kind of just that youth, that innocence, and a little bit of that kind of nervousness, like he can play kind of an insecure, nervous kid really, really well, and we knew we needed that. So so then we went with Tom, and then Dan, you want to talk about Chris a little bit?
I mean, in hindsight, it seems obvious because he's so like Barley, but it really wasn't right away. And Barley has to do a lot of annoying things, but it has to be done in a lovable way. And I think Chris is so charismatic and charming, and his joy and exuberance is so you just want to follow him anywhere. And so that was really helpful as far as why we picked Chris, is just that excitement he has and that desire to, want him as your older brother, and also he can improvise and bring a little more surprises to the character, a character who's all about being chaotic and unexpected.
Did Tom and Chris do any scenes together when they were voicing in the same room, or did they do it separately of each other?
He's mostly separate, but we got them together one day. Their schedules were, as you can imagine, trying to get them both in one place at the same time proved to be challenging. So, but we did get them together for one day, and it was really great. It was really great to kind of, I think, for them to learn more about the other character in the room and how they would play off one another. But yeah, Dan, anything about that day? It was really fun.
It was really fun. Yeah, I mean, it was really great. And they, like Kori said, they are friends. They know each other. They have a brotherly quality. And
yeah,
but yeah, sometimes it's just very hard to get people together.
totally.
Great. I'm going to take a question from the audience. This question's from Mark Walton. How you doing, Mark? Was the production team crushed when the timing of the theatrical release crashed into the breaking of the pandemic in the US and the closing of theaters? Were you party to the decision to release it online early?
Were we crushed? Yeah.
You were crushed?
Yeah.
I mean, it was, as everyone remembers, it was such a confusing time and scary. I mean, right off the bat, we were probably more distracted by what was happening in the world than even really being able to fathom what it meant to the movie over time, over the next week or two.
Yeah.
It was discussed, the idea to put the film on Disney Plus, and by that point, I think for us it was just nice that it could be something people could watch. People were stuck at home, and that's something that families could enjoy together. And then it's been really wonderful getting messages from people on social media who would send pictures of them with their kids having decorated their house to look like a movie theater, watching Onward that night.
Right.
And then people who, quite frankly, people who said, like, I'll be honest, I didn't want to see this movie. I wasn't interested, but I watched it and I loved it. Was kind of a surprise that a lot of people who maybe wouldn't have saw it. And then just people's personal connections to their own relationships with their parents who they lost or their siblings have just meant the world to all of us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think what the interesting thing is, in not necessarily hindsight, but a little bit, like the thematics of the film are also related to what a lot of people have been going through. in the last 8 months. And in terms of the focus on family, the focus on out of necessity kind of, but in a also positive way, and those around them, and kind of just having a different perspective of people watching this film during this time, I think has been pretty profound and really healing for us as filmmakers. You know what I mean? To kind of not to work on something for 6 years and not really have that opening that you're planning on, and yet having something that may end up being even more far-reaching was really great, and kind of sunk in as the months of the pandemic continued. It's been a real kind of blessing, to be honest.
What a great attitude. Yeah, I know I was planning to see the film theatrically as well. And then I believe the pandemic hit. I think it was a week after the film was released, things started happening. So I ended up watching it on Disney Plus and thoroughly enjoyed the experience. And I know a lot of people who wouldn't have seen the film got to see it because of its release on streaming. And I think that's a really good thing to have people watch more animation if they can't get to the theaters. So yeah, I know you grew an audience. We have another question here from Laura Aragon. What were some of the last minute changes that just had to get done, and how were they tackled? How did they impact production?
You know, it's funny. It's funny, Noah, you said we always had the beginning and we always had the end. And I think, did we always have the beginning?
Didn't always have the beginning.
Sometimes
That's true.
We had the meeting, you know, the dad arriving,
Yeah.
but we didn't have much prior to that. We didn't have
Yeah, that's true.
and you know, the intro to Ian and Barley. But
sometimes when you're working on a story, you know, it is great if you have the ending and then you're figuring out the meat of how that character grows. And I think it's somewhat fitting sometimes that the ending comes last, because that's just about setting up all the stuff that you have. But for us, yeah, the introduction of Ian in particular came really late, right, Allison? I mean, we were animating that and changing our minds on it. That was one of the things I recall.
Yeah, that was a big sequence at the beginning. You know, we called it Chaotic House, but it was like a chaotic sequence of a lot of characters and a lot going on. And that one happened at the end rather quickly. So it was one of those things we just had to get through really quickly.
yeah, I think maybe Chaotic House and Final Battle might have been in production at the same time.
Yeah.
Which is a little crazy, or very close to one another, because Final Battle was also at the end, right?
Yeah.
And that was, of course, the scene that was the final battle with the giant dragon. So very intense scenes to be doing near the end.
Yeah. I don't know that we had any big changes at the end, though. Like, I don't know that we, aside from really coming up with Ian's intro, I'm not sure. I don't know that we had any big surprises that we had to push. It was more, we had a great crew who had planned really, really well and worked together. But it was kind of sometimes those things don't always line up even, you know, as well as you plan. So there's always a big push at the end. But we had a lot of big, meaty, juicy stuff, both like Ian's intro as well as Final Battle and big scenes all happening at once. So it was.
I do remember we did, after our audience preview, we cut down our Act 1 quite a bit.
Yeah,
it was a little long. And but that, to Kori's point, we were lucky to have a very good, smart crew of people planning things, because none of that stuff had been animated yet.
Right.
I think.
Right.
So with exception of maybe a shot or two. So
Yeah.
all the things we cut at the end were still storyboarded, and I don't even know if they were laid out yet. So
It's true. Yeah. We were honest about what we were struggling with, which was Ian's introduction. And so we held it kind of for last.
Prologue waited quite a long time as well. And we tried millions of different versions, and it ended up actually quite close to where it went full circle. But yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, one interesting thing about working on Ian's introduction and the final battle was we got to see Ian evolved over the film in terms of his physicality. At the beginning, he was a little bit more closed and small and tight. And by the end, he was meant to have gotten a little bit looser, you know, his clothes change a little bit. He's broader. He can do the spells more confidently. So we could really animate that contrast at the same time and really feel the difference.
Right.
That's great. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Allison, what was the hardest character to animate?
I think Colt was a pretty difficult character, just combining, I mean, quadruped horse walk can be quite challenging, as well as like a horse acting and doing stuff like getting out of cars and things. But yeah, he was pretty challenging.
And that was my answer. I was going to say, I bet he was the hardest character to animate. So, and I'm getting the highs, and it looks like we're just about at the end of time here. Are there any other thoughts you'd like to share with our audience while we have you on the film? Maybe thank you for watching the film, or more to come.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just thanks so much to everyone who's watched and enjoyed the film. And like I said, we're always so amazed and excited when people, you know, write and comment about how a film inspired them or touched their lives. And like I said, there's some people who had similar experiences to me, but there's people who had nothing like my experience, but just feel like there was someone in my life or their life who went above and beyond to help them become who they are today. And I think to me, that's what Barley is in the story. And that's what I hope makes it universal. And that's what we're always striving for with these films, is something hopefully that will connect with people and inspire them and move them and make them laugh.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So much, everyone.
So, okay, everybody. Noah, Allison, Dan, Kori, myself, thank you everybody so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure. If you haven't seen the film, go see it. It's available on Disney Plus. You'll enjoy the film, I promise you. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.